After throwing a mad party the night before, I began the video at Chandler Park.
So you're just going to throw a party and leave trash laying all over the place? Typical millennial.
Hold on, I came back to pick it up later. I just needed some coffee to kick in first. Just felt a little bit groggy after all the hijinks and hilarity from the previous night. I'm sure most of you can understand that. Chandler Park is named after one of Detroit's earliest mayors, Zachariah Chandler, who was elected into office in 1851. Chandler also served in the U.S. Senate afterwards. The original size of the park was 230 acres until I-94 was constructed through the northern edge of the park in the 1950s. Now it's down to about 200 acres. Chandler Park might not hold bike races and parades like they used to, but today there's still some decent amenities to the park if you can get past all of the trash laying around. The park has an 18-hole golf course and it's home to the Wayne County Family Aquatic Center, which has a 4.5 out of 5 rating on Google. And today we all know that Google reviews and ratings is the end-all be-all when it comes to anyone's credibility anymore. This is going to be my 13th video in my Detroit series where I go through the entire city. The area of the city that I venture through in this video is bounded by Connor Street to the east, Mack Avenue to the south, Mount Elliott Street and Mound Road to the west, and McNichols to the north. This area of town doesn't really have any names for the neighborhoods that we go through, as it's generally just thought of as a part of the east side. Throughout the city, most people just refer to an area by saying the major intersection that they're near, such as Warren and Van Dyke. But if you want to put a name to the whole area that I go through, we'll mostly be inside of the 48213 zip code. Well, as always, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to drop a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, as doing all of those things helps these videos destroy the evil monster that is the YouTube algorithm. Also, make sure to hit that notification bell so that you can be notified every time that I upload a new video. If you're new to this channel, I'm on a journey to visit as many places in the United States as I possibly can, and you can always check out my custom-made interactive map that shows you a visual on all of the places that I've made videos on so far. Last but not least, if you can't get enough of me on here, you can always go follow me on my other social media accounts, and all of those links are down below. Some of the more notable things that we come across in this video includes the Packard Plant, in which many of you have been asking me about in my other Detroit videos. You'll have more awesome drone footage of it, just like this, later on in the video. We'll go past the Better Made factory, which is a popular chip brand here in southeastern Michigan, and we also go by the city airport, which has a large abandoned neighborhood just to the west of it, and right now, that's where we're heading towards. Now, towards the end of this video, there is a nicer, well-kept looking neighborhood that we go through, but mostly this section of the city is fairly bleak. Throughout this video, I'm also going to talk about how the auto industry has played a role in Detroit's downfall. Now, I don't like to get into political sides despite what some of you like to insinuate in the comment sections of my videos, but the downfall of the auto industry and the overall decline in manufacturing jobs throughout this country has a lot to do with political decisions that were made on a national scale, a state-by-state scale, and a local scale, and we'll get into all of that later on. This street right here is full of older industrial buildings. Some of them are in use, and some are not. And just past the string of warehouses, the street becomes residential pretty quick. Alright, well, a big part of Detroit's economic downward spiral has to do with the decline of a tax base. The reason why Detroit was a massive city to begin with, being the fourth largest city in the country for a decade or so, was because of the hundreds of thousands of jobs available in the auto industry. Henry Ford was the Elon Musk of his era, and his factories led the way in Detroit, providing more jobs for unskilled workers than anywhere else. It was the perfect formula for these immigrants to come to Detroit and seek the American dream. The glory days for Detroit didn't last very long though, and for that you can thank the United Auto Workers Union, or the UAW, which was formed in Detroit in May of 1935. The union encouraged auto workers to go on strike to fight for higher wages. These strikes would halt production at these auto plants, which meant that vehicles couldn't be made, and that these companies had no choice but to buy into what the members of the union were fighting for. Ultimately, that made things way more expensive for these companies to produce cars. And in some cases, it helped kill entire car brands, like the Packard company that we'll come across later. So, how did things all start? Not only did these large automotive companies close up their assembly plants within the city limits of Detroit, but the auto companies, along with the people, started leaving the city around the 1950s as they headed towards the suburbs. First, I'll talk about the residents, as Detroit hit a peak population of 1.8 million back in 1950, while today the city is home to just over 600,000, making it a loss of 1.2 million people. Side note, as when I was driving along I came across this stray dog that was eating from the trash. Stray dogs are a big problem in Detroit, as people will dump off their dogs at city parks or in other vacant parts of the city. And the part of the city that I'm driving through right now is a mostly abandoned neighborhood between the city airport to the east and Van Dyke to the west. Well, most of you know this, but it's just the basics of how cities work. All of the residents pay taxes to their local government to provide services such as police, fire departments, and schools. As people continued to leave, the city of Detroit continued to raise its taxes for the residents to try to make up for the loss, which only made people want to leave even more. Less tax dollars means less funds to renovate schools, improve police and fire services, and provide the city's residents with a better quality of life. I'll continue on with that later, as we're coming across some other talking points here. Illegal dumping is a common occurrence throughout many of Detroit's vacant neighborhoods, and you see it here. And it's kind of eerie to see the random streetlight here and there on blocks that have no homes left. In this neighborhood, you're going to see a lot of water over different streets, as this video was filmed a day after a torrential downpour in the Metro Detroit area. And this particular street is vacant all the way from here to the city airport straight ahead. There are several streets in this neighborhood that look just like this one, full of illegal dumping, no homes left, overgrown vegetation, you name it. Really quick, as the city airport is often called the city airport, as it's the airport in the city. Seems pretty simple, but technically it's called the Coleman A. Young International Airport. The airport opened as the Detroit City Airport Terminal in 1927, and it served as the main airport for the greater Detroit area until 1947, when Willow Run was built near Ypsilanti. This particular airport never expanded because it didn't have room to, as it's surrounded by 3 cemeteries, and at the time, it was surrounded by vibrant neighborhoods, like the one that we're in right now. The name of the airport changed to Coleman A. Young in 2003 after the city's first African American mayor. Back in 2020, there was an article that came out in the Detroit News where the city announced plans to expand the city airport and clear out this neighborhood that we're in right now. Those plans haven't advanced, and there's no word on whether or not those plans are still in the future for the city airport. Back to the story of Detroit's decline, not only were people moving out of the city and towards the suburbs in the era of the 1950s to the 60s, but like I said, so were the auto companies. The assembly plants that were built in the city of Detroit were built with the first stages of technology when it comes to mass production of automobiles. Many of the industrial plants in the city limits were becoming outdated in the 50s and 60s. More often than not, it would cost companies less money to build a new plant in the suburbs than it did to fix up the old joint that they had in the city. Not only that, but Detroit had auto union wage requirements that they had to meet. Between 1947 and 1963, Detroit lost 140,000 manufacturing jobs. Keep in mind that that is Detroit City, not the metro area. During the same time frame, the Big Three ended up building 25 different assembly plants in the suburbs and not a single new plant in the city limits. For those who don't know, the Big Three refers to the Big Three automakers of Ford, GM, and Chrysler. The taxes were also lower in the suburbs, and that helped the Big Three during that era to build cars cheaper and more quickly than ever before. Production was so high that they ended up putting several independent car brands that were still in the city out of business, as those brands weren't able to keep up due to the auto union wage requirements in the city. That whole decentralizing movement of the auto industry from the city to the suburbs was a huge reason for the start of Detroit's downfall, and that doesn't get talked about as much as it should. Not necessarily the decline of the auto industry, just the auto industry moving out of the city to avoid paying auto union wages. More on that in a minute, as straight ahead is the Holy Name of Jesus Church and School, which is addressed to Van Dyke. The church portion of the campus is closer to Van Dyke, while the back part of the campus was where the school was, and we're seeing the back part of the campus currently. The school closed in the 1980s, and the church portion of campus has been in and out of use over the years. One historical event that occurred here was the funeral of Patrick McNamara, who was a U.S. Senator. Making an appearance at the funeral was someone no other than the 36th President, Lyndon B. Johnson. It looks like the church is back in use now as a Catholic entity. So in between all of the things that we continue to come across in this video, I've been talking about the decline of the auto industry. One example of the Big Three auto companies decentralizing their workforce from Detroit City proper is Ford's River Rouge plant.
The River Rouge plant is in Dearborn, not Detroit. Do your research.
Yeah, but it's a good example for what I'm talking about here, because it was one of the first massive auto assembly plants that were built, and it's just a great example for this particular thing that I'm trying to explain. As in 1941, Ford wanted to counteract the power that the unions had by splitting up its workforce to other facilities, because at one point, the Rouge River plant employed around 100,000 workers. The idea of splitting up the workforce was to reduce the risk of a strike breaking out at the Rouge River plant, which would halt production and hurt the company's profits. Decentralizing their operations reduced that risk, as if there was a strike at one plant, then another plant would be unaffected and some production would be allowed to continue. Opening up new plants also allowed newer technology to be implemented at newer facilities, which I talked about earlier. The Rouge River plant went from having nearly 100,000 workers in 1930 down to 30,000 in 1960, a 70% decrease, and only employing 3,000 in 1990. Well, since the auto industry had such a dominant presence in Detroit during the peak years of the 1930s to the 50s, when the automakers moved the majority of their manufacturing jobs to the suburbs, it goes without saying that the city of Detroit fell hard, and the Motor City became the poster child of the Rust Belt. Another city that similarly relied on one industry that suffered greatly during this era was Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or the Steel City, as Pittsburgh relied heavily on the steel industry. However, no other city fell harder than Detroit did. To the left is what used to be the Holmes A.L. Elementary and Middle School, and today it's the A.L. Holmes Academy of Blended Learning. Another killer to not only the auto industry but to manufacturing jobs all over this country was the North American Free Trade Agreement, aka NAFTA, which was put into place back in 1994. The idea was for there to be a free trade zone between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. What actually happened was that this agreement made it easier for companies to move their manufacturing jobs to Mexico, where labor is cheaper. Therefore, profits for these companies would be larger. NAFTA basically allowed goods to be imported into the United States from Mexico without being taxed. Companies all across the United States have taken advantage of the cheaper labor and costs down in Mexico to an extent, whereas in 2016, the state's trade deficit with Mexico was at $63 billion, which means that the U.S. brought in that much more trade from Mexico than Mexico did with the United States. Well, despite the downfall of the city's economy over the years, most locals can rest easy knowing that their beloved better-made chips are still made here in Detroit. Better Made, along with Verner's and Faygo, is one of those brands that most locals are extremely proud of, very prideful. Better Made has been around since 1853, but it didn't catch on until after World War I. In 1930, two businessmen combined to form the company, and it's been located off of Gratiot Avenue since 1940. At one time in history, Detroit had over 20 potato chip manufacturers within the city limits, and Better Made is a survivor from that era. Well, now we have crossed over 94 and we're in the area of Shoemaker and Lilbridge Street, which is another industrial area that time has forgotten. Well, since its peak, Michigan has lost over 300,000 manufacturing jobs. Some people like to argue and say that it's because more robots are doing the work, but most people believe that it's because the cost to manufacture products in the U.S. is way higher than it is in other countries. And most of that is because of how much you have to pay workers here in the United States compared to other countries, and because of higher taxes. Ford and General Motors are companies who are still really high up on the Fortune 500 list, but they have quite a few different assembly plants overseas for this very reason. Ahead on the left, you have the Barack Obama Leadership Academy, which is on a street that is otherwise completely vacant. And it's impossible to ignore the piles of garbage that fills up this street here. Lastly, regarding the auto industry, is that the industry relies on consumers purchasing cars. Obviously, and cars aren't necessarily cheap, it's quite an investment. If the economy is going through a recession, less people are going to be able to afford new cars, and that's going to have a negative effect on the auto industry, just like it did in 2008. Most of us know that General Motors filed for bankruptcy in 2009 during the recession. It was the largest industrial bankruptcy in history and the fourth overall largest filing in U.S. history. Some people would blame the recession for that occurrence, but it was more so just years of poor management and misguided investments in making their cars, as competitors from overseas didn't suffer the same fate. General Motors reported sales losses in the years prior to the recession, dropping by as much as 45% in 2007. Most of us know that the Obama administration was able to save General Motors by bailing them out through substantial financial aid. Other companies, such as Ford, struggled to survive during the recession. However, Ford never filed for bankruptcy. Chrysler filed for bankruptcy in 2009 as well, and Chrysler went on to merge with the European brand of Fiat, and today, Chrysler is owned by Stellantis, which is in the Netherlands. However, Chrysler is still a major employer in southeastern Michigan, as its headquarters are in the suburb of Auburn Hills. I'm sure that once upon a time, one-way streets were needed through this section of Detroit, but not so much today. Warren heads west while Forest Avenue heads east, and both streets look like shells of their former selves throughout this section of the city. At least you have several historic churches to reminisce upon. Despite the changes that we've seen in the auto industry over the years, ultimately I believe that the city has nobody to blame but itself for the decades of instability and poor leadership from multiple mayors, and the poor culture that encouraged under-the-table segregation practices in the 1950s and 60s. I say this because Ford and GM are number 21 and 22 on the Fortune 500 list today. And the auto industry is still a powerful engine for the economy in southeastern Michigan. Just wait until I start making videos on cities in Oakland County, as it's a night and day difference on what it looks like there compared to what you see here. Suburbs throughout Wayne County and Macomb County, you could say the same thing. The economy in southeastern Michigan continues to diversify as well. The problem for Detroit is that anyone who moves to the area is moving to the suburbs because of the awful state that the city is in today, which is from years of high crime rates, high taxes, and poor city leadership. There have been so many higher-ups who have worked for the city over the years that have done its residents wrong by embezzling money, by not handling money the way that it should be handled, and by not keeping up with the city's infrastructure. We can talk about that and Detroit's bankruptcy in another video, as I have about 15 more left that need to be uploaded. Well, most of you know where we are now, which is at the Packard Plant. There used to be an iconic pedestrian bridge over East Grand Boulevard that connected the two parts of the plant, but the structure had been in such disrepair that the bridge collapsed after an ice storm in January of 2019. Here's a Google Street View image of the walkway. The plant was opened in 1906, and it once produced hundreds of thousands of Packard automobiles. It consisted originally of 10,000 square feet of space, and it was considered to be the most modern assembly plant in the world upon its grand opening. Over time, the plant saw expansions to where it had over 3.5 million square feet. Automaking was put to a pause here, however, early on, as the plant was a huge contributor in building aircraft engines for World War I. After the war, automaking resumed, and as time went on, sales dwindled as the Great Depression hit. In 1942, the plant saw a boost as it again was used to supply the U.S. with manufacturing for World War II. Aircraft engines were manufactured here along with other power units for military vehicles. Detroit led the nation in supplying vehicles for the war, and this plant played a huge part in it. The plant employed up to 36,000 people during the years of World War II. The Packard plant expanded to about 80 buildings over 80 acres when it was all said and done. After the war, Packard automobiles started to get built here again. However, this is when the company started to decline. Many of the plant's workers were members of the U.A.W., in which the contracts of the employees required the company to pay them pensions. On the flip side, the executives of the company didn't have any pensions, and they never gave up their positions to younger professionals as they didn't have that security in place. Basically, over time, the company was poorly managed, and the U.A.W. ran the funds dry. In 1954, the Packard Company was in very poor standing. They had bought the failing Studebaker Corporation, and at the time, the merger created the fourth largest automobile brand. However, during this same time, production of Packard automobiles were transferred to a modern facility off of Connor Avenue. The original Packard plant was operating at a capacity of only 50%. And this neighborhood just to the east of the Packard plant appears to have fallen just as hard as the plant has. Anyway, I looked up several articles on the history of the plant through what seemed to be credible sources, but they all said different things. The best that I could gather from it all is that between 1954 and 56, the plant was being dismantled, and during that time span, 7,500 employees were laid off. Jobs were being transferred to the suburb of Utica to the north at the engineering and transmission plant. In 1956, the last Packard was manufactured at the Connor Avenue plant, and by 1958, the Packard brand was discontinued. And this massive concrete structure has been standing here vacant since 1956. Current Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan has announced that one of his biggest goals in his current term is to make sure that the Packard plant gets demolished. The plant has exchanged hands of real estate developers over the years, and there have been many different ideas on how they can keep the current structure and redevelop it for other uses. But on April 13th of 2022, Duggan had had enough of playing games. Wayne County Judge Brian Sullivan ordered the current Peruvian businessman and owner of the Packard plant, Fernando Palazzulo, to finish the demolition of the property in 90 days, and that the wrecking ball must start swinging by May 12th of 2022. Palazzulo had bought the property in 2013 with hopes to renovate the place, but those plans were never implemented, obviously. If Palazzulo doesn't cooperate, then the city has the rights to engage qualified contractors to perform the demolition, and Palazzolo will still be responsible for the costs associated with the demolition. Lastly, I ended up driving through Pingree Park. You can also think of this as an extension of the much nicer Indian Village neighborhood, which is to the south of Mac and will be featured in another video. I cut out quite a bit of driving footage in between the Packard Plant and this neighborhood because it's all mostly the same vacant and abandoned blocks that you've already seen enough of throughout this video. Detroit has pockets of streets here and there that still look really nice, just like the one that we're on right now. Most of the small nice neighborhoods though are surrounded by urban blight, and they are all assigned to Detroit's public schools, which aren't that great. On the flip side, police response times have improved greatly in certain areas of the city. Response times are still pretty bad in the worst crime-ridden areas of Detroit, but downtown and in the nicer neighborhoods, there is a pretty good improvement on response time. Well, with that said, I do end the video here. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to drop a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, as doing all of those things helps these videos destroy the evil monster that is the YouTube algorithm. Also, make sure to hit that notification bell and select yes, so that you can be notified every time that I upload a new video. If you enjoyed this video, then you might enjoy checking out some of the featured playlists on this channel. Videos with amazing insights on other places like what you saw here can be found in my Detroit playlist, my American Hoods playlist, or in my Michigan playlist. Last but not least, if you can't get enough of me on here, you can always go follow me on my other social media accounts, and those links are below. We'll see you next time. Peace!